Hey guys, Connor here from Kamerastore.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Canon AE-1. This is the most popular SLR by far of the past few years, and today we're going to be talking about some alternatives to it, what makes it popular, and some other cameras that can do basically the same thing, maybe even for a lower price. Why is the AE-1 so popular? A big thing is that the AE-1 is everywhere. It's one of the best-selling SLRs of all time. There are millions of them out there. A lot of the time, if you're finding a camera secondhand or a relative is giving you one that's a vintage SLR, this could be one of them. The camera sold so well thanks to a huge marketing campaign from Canon to market this to amateurs and sort of intermediate hobbyists. It did well because it has fully manual exposure as well as automatic mode. So you just put the lens into the A setting here, and now the camera will pick an aperture based on the shutter speed that we have selected. So this really made it easy for people who otherwise might not have been using an SLR to pick one up and get high quality photos. This was also a quite lightweight and low cost model compared to some other automatic exposure cameras of the time. Obviously it's not low weight with this massive 55 1.2 lens on it, but it's quite a low weight body and quite a small body compared to some professional offerings of the time. So that's another reason why you might want an AE-1. And all these things sort of put together basically end up with the AE-1 being an exceptionally popular camera that is well sought after today, even 40, 50 years after it was released. So why would you not want a Canon AE-1? Well, popularity often means higher prices, so everybody's looking for these, and that means that markets are high and prices are high as well. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more of a budget option, there are tons of other SLRs out there that can do more or less the same thing as the AE-1, but without breaking the bank. So what we'll do now is look into the features of the AE-1, why it's so popular, and lay out some cameras that can also do these things, have similar features, and maybe will be better options for you if you're looking for an SLR. Let's start with simple auto exposure. The Canon AE-1, it's right there in the name here, AE auto exposure, has shutter priority auto exposure, as I mentioned earlier, so we pick a shutter speed and the camera picks an aperture. This camera was the first 35mm SLR to feature a microprocessor in here. That is basically a very, very small computer that calculates exposure for us. Earlier models used sort of light sensitive diodes and very simple electronics, and this gave you a bit more accuracy when metering. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was a huge deal at the time and gave the AE-1 really accurate, intelligent metering compared to its competitors. But with the gift of hindsight, we can see that there's plenty of other options that offer auto exposure, some with maybe more advanced metering than the AE-1 and some with less advanced, but with auto exposure nonetheless. Some other cameras that offer a shutter priority experience would be something like the Canon A1, which is sort of the big brother of the AE-1, but offers shutter priority and aperture priority. You can see that there, as well as fully programmed exposure. The AE-1 kind of has it all. It's basically the prosumer model of the AE-1. Gives you more features and oftentimes costs the same, if not less. Another option for shutter priority would be the Konica line of SLRs. We have the Konica Auto Reflex T4 here. Pop a lens on and it would have an A mode just like the AE-1. So, two great options there for shutter priority. In terms of aperture priority, you have way more options, like I said. So you have stuff like the Nikon FE, Pentax ME and ME Super, Olympus OM-2, and even something like the Canon AV-1, which is very similar, you can see, to the AE-1, just aperture priority only. As you can see, and there's plenty more, I can have a little bit of a list here, there's tons of options for other SLRs that give you automatic exposure. So the AE-1's not unique in that. You can find other options. As I mentioned before, the AE-1 is one of the most abundant cameras out there. There's millions of these that were produced throughout the early 80s into the mid 80s. It's not really a feature of the camera itself, but it's worth mentioning in the modern film landscape that some cameras were more successful than others commercially, and that does affect their value today. So one reason that a popular camera like the AE-1 is a good buy is that there's a lot of access to spare parts and repairs or replacements. With an obscure camera or one that's maybe not as valuable, repair shops won't keep spare parts or donor bodies, and they might not have the know-how to fix them based on repair manuals or other stuff like that. Whereas with something like the AE-1, it's worth their time to learn how to repair these, so they will. They'll learn how to figure out even the electronic issues sometimes that these will have. Whereas even a mechanical camera, and I know the internet loves mechanical cameras because they don't need batteries, but an obscure mechanical camera will have a lower chance of being repairable than something like this, just because of the popularity. Some other cameras that sold really well would be the Pentax K1000. This is probably the AE-1's biggest direct competitor for the illustrious title of the best student camera. This is a fully manual camera only, but Pentax made millions of these from the 70s into the 90s, so these are pretty easy to find and easy to find parts for as well. Some other options would be the Canon EOS 300 if you want something a bit more automatic. These are pretty much everywhere as well. Or the Canon FTB QL for a slightly older version of the AE-1. Again, manual only and mechanical, but quite easy to find. Quite many of them were made. Great options there if you want a popular camera that maybe you could get repaired if something goes wrong. Back to the AE-1 again. The third feature I want to talk about is the ergonomics. So the AE-1 is a quite lightweight camera. It is made of plastic. It feels like metal, but it's a plastic treated in a certain way to make it feel as much like metal as possible. It's fooled plenty of people on the internet, me included. The advantage of this is that it's as lightweight as plastic and feels like metal. Sort of the best of both worlds. It makes the AE-1 a lot lighter than something like this Nikon EL, which is all metal. You can see they're roughly similar sizes. The Nikon is a bit bigger, but the Nikon is a lot heavier. That's the advantage of that plastic body. And this isn't the smallest camera in the world, but it does have quite a good size for your hands, and also the battery door here is a great little grip that your fingers can rest on when you have your finger on the shutter. Canon did actually improve on this design later when they added the AE-1 program. This is the successor to the AE-1. It adds fully programmed exposure right there. And it's also got this big grip on it that really is quite comfortable and was kind of unheard of at this point in terms of 35mm SLRs. Most of them had these sort of flat sides. So some alternatives to the AE-1 in terms of ergonomics that are nice feeling cameras that control quite well. As I said, the AE-1 program handles very similarly to the AE-1. The Minolta X700 is a great example as well. It's got this grip here, as well as a nice big shutter speed dial that's easy to turn. The Pentax ME and ME Super are super small. You can see it sort of when comparing it to the other bodies, that it's quite a bit smaller. The same is true of the Olympus OM-1 and 2, which are, again, super small bodies. These are a bit heavier because they are metal, but they make up for that with quite small frames and very comfortable handling. And the final thing to talk about when discussing the AE-1 is lens availability. So the Canon AE-1 uses the Canon FD lens mount. It's this breech lock system. These lenses were made from 1964 until 1992, and Canon themselves made 134 lenses for this mount, and it received ubiquitous support from third parties. There's tons of lenses from companies like Tamron, Sigma, Vivitar for the Canon AE-1. This makes it easy to get into and to find lenses in whatever focal length you're looking for. With other mounts that are maybe a bit less popular, finding lenses outside of 50, 100, 135, 28mm maybe can be quite hard and gets expensive really quickly. But with Canon, most of these lenses are easily available. They do get expensive, but that's more up to the cinema conversions that are being done on Canon FD glass. So that's maybe one reason why you'd want to look elsewhere for getting into a mount. It's something to consider when buying a camera, is what lenses will be available and will I be able to afford them. Some good alternative systems would be Nikon F. This is another system that's been made for decades and has lots of lens compatibility. These lenses are quite a bit cheaper as well. They don't do cinema conversions because the focal throw on these is backwards from most of the competition, so a little unintentional future-proofing by vintage Nikon designers. But yeah, these lenses are widely available and can be quite a bit cheaper. A great option there. Another one would be Pentax K. And this is probably the cheapest mount to get into, just because this was what's called an open mount. So there were many companies that made cameras for Pentax K, and thus normal lenses like 35, 50, 85, 100 that third-party manufacturers normally wouldn't make for a mount like Nikon F or Canon FD. They made them for Pentax K. So there's Cosina, Chinon, Ricoh make 50mm lenses and standard lenses, and that means that there's tons of options for different budgets in Pentax K. A great option there as well. So what have we learned about the Canon AE-1? It's a popular model because it's easy to use and quite abundant. It has some automatic features as well as low weight, but it still looks and feels vintage, so satisfies that analog itch that a lot of us have. It doesn't necessarily do anything better than a lot of the other cameras, but it is more popular, again, because of its abundance. So yeah, now it's time to give a special highlight to a couple models that I think are great specific alternatives to the AE-1 aside from the ones that we've already shown today. We'll start with the Minolta X500 and X700. I have the X700 here, a bit after the AE-1 in terms of production, but they have, again, fully automatic or aperture priority auto exposure as well as manual exposure. The X700 has fully programmed exposure as well, so the camera will pick shutter speed and aperture for you. And this is a really useful feature. This really set the X700 apart from the competition. I really do think the X500 is probably the better choice. The big difference between the X700 and X500 is that the X500 actually tells you what shutter speed you have selected. The other big advantage is that the X500 is quite a bit cheaper than this one. The X700 is also a great option to replace the AE-1, but I would recommend looking for the X500. It's very similar looking, just a slightly different number. The lenses as well. The Minolta MD lenses are excellent lenses, as good as anything Canon made, but considerably cheaper. These are criminally underrated choices. Yeah, if you're looking for an alternative, this handles really similarly to the AE-1. It's pretty clear where they got their inspiration from. Check out the X700 or X500. If you want something a bit more metal feeling, how about this? This is the Nikon FE. The FE is, like I said, a fully metal body. It's a bit bigger than the X700 or the AE-1, but it makes up for it with rugged construction. So these are excellent, robust cameras that we recommend. The mechanics at our store almost all use Nikon cameras and really think that they're some of the best ones out there. This, again, has aperture priority auto exposure, so you pick the aperture, and the camera picks a shutter speed. That is easy to use and simple, and works really well with the FE's excellent viewfinder. So if we jump into the viewfinder view of the Nikon FE, you'll see on the left-hand side we have our shutter speed readout, and there's a green line that tells you what shutter speed you have selected, and then the needle, which tells you what shutter speed the camera would recommend, and that's based on the aperture value, which you can see just above the frame. So again, there's a mirror in here that shows you the aperture from your lens. So with those two combined, it's pretty easy. You can see all the necessary information, what the camera wants from you, what you have selected, and really you don't have to take your eye away from the finder no matter what. A really excellent viewfinder that makes the FE one of the best user experiences in film photography. Unfortunately, the FE is also one of the most popular cameras out there. The FM is maybe a bit more popular, but the FE still has quite many fans. If you want something that's kind of like the FE, but not as expensive, I would look at these Nikkormat cameras, the Nikkormat EL and EL2. These are very similar. They're the predecessors to the FE. They're just slightly bigger cameras. If you have bigger hands, you may actually prefer a camera like this. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest advantages of the Nikon F system that all the Nikon SLRs use is that it went from 1959 until basically today with only some small variations, so a lot of lenses will work on these cameras. Nikon FE, great choice. Our next recommendation is the Pentax ME Super. I have the ME here, but they're very similar cameras. The only difference is that the ME Super has fully manual exposure. There are two buttons right here, I can put a photo up as well, that allow you to manually control the shutter speed. Again, this camera is electronically controlled with aperture priority and manual mode. It's a metal body, and its main thing is that it is super, super small. So if we compare it to the AE-1, you can see obviously this lens is gigantic, but the bodies are significantly different sizes. Despite having similar features to the AE-1, this camera sells for about a third of the price. The manual mode can be a bit difficult with the two buttons here, but in automatic mode this thing really shines, and when paired with a lens like this 40mm f2.8, this is basically a pocketable kit. It becomes sort of an aperture priority point and shoot, which is a really great thing. If you're looking for a small camera, this one really, it's hard to beat the ME or ME Super. Pentax K in general, this whole mount is pretty cheap to get into because it was an open mount. So you're able to find lenses of basically every focal length quite easily and quite cheaply. A great mount to look into if you're a beginner or your budget is small. My final recommendation for an AE-1 alternative is the Olympus OM-2. Like the others, this is an electronically controlled aperture priority and fully manual SLR. This is, again, like the ME Super, a very small SLR when compared to the AE-1. You can see the bodies are quite a bit different. The OM-2 is smaller, not necessarily lighter because this is fully metal instead of the plastic that the AE-1 is made of. Still, an easy camera to carry around all day, and a comfortable camera to hold in your hands. Despite its compact size, the OM-2 has a really excellent viewfinder that actually changes depending on the mode that you're in. So when I have it off, you can see that there's nothing on the left-hand side there. But if I pop it into manual mode, you'll see basically a match needle system. So the goal is to get the needle on the left-hand side to the center of that plus and minus. But if I go ahead and switch it into auto mode, that display switches to a shutter speed readout, and that tells you what shutter speed the camera will pick depending on the aperture that you have selected. People also think that the OM system is easy to use because it has all of the settings that you need right next to each other. So you have the aperture, the focus, and the shutter speed all on the lens barrel here. Regardless though, this display is quite a bit more flexible than the one in the AE-1, which only has the aperture value on the right hand side and sort of gets difficult to use in manual mode especially. And that's a big plus of the OM-2. So if we go ahead and we look inside the viewfinder of the AE-1, just for comparison, we can see that the needle there tells you what aperture the lens will pick. This camera is in auto mode right now. So if I half press the shutter, the needle jumps down and tells us what aperture it'll select based on the shutter speed that we've picked. But if I pop that out of auto mode, then you'll see there's just a flashing red M, and that tells us that we're in manual mode. But it doesn't tell us what aperture we have selected, it just tells us what aperture it would pick. So conclusions about the AE-1. In this video we've gone over some of the most important features and reasons why the AE-1 is popular, so that hopefully you can sort of assess for yourself whether or not this is the right camera for you, or if maybe one of the others that we recommended is a better fit. It's up to you to do your research, understand why cameras are the way they are, and figure out what's best for you by trial and error, by research, by watching videos like this. Just keep looking. There's tons of brands out there, tons of models, and most of them will take pretty good pictures if you get one that's working and one with a clean lens. Anyway, that's all for today. Be sure to check Kamerastore for the camera of your dreams, as well as sign up for our email list to be notified about new products weekly. I've been Connor from Kamerastore. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.